Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Initially, and rightly so, everybody came to this conclusion that the developed world has caused this problem, therefore they are responsible and they should pay for it. And the Kyoto Protocol was signed, but it was a dead horse. It never really delivered anything. The world soon realized that nothing is happening and junked it, and that's how they started working on the Paris Agreement. The whole idea of Paris Agreement was this collective thing that this is a global issue and it's a stock and flow problem. The climate change has been caused by whatever greenhouse gases are there, and it's getting aggravated by the additional greenhouse gases that we are adding. So very deftly, the negotiators or the creators of the Paris Agreement came up with a clause called common but differentiated responsibilities. The basic premise of that was that whoever has caused the problem, we understand, but we have a common goal now. We need to save this planet. So therefore, all of us need to march in the same direction.
Every day we hear something unusual. A fire here, a flood there, a storm surge, a cloudburst. These events affect all of us, our well-being, our health, our family, our work. Their frequency and intensity are increasing. Fortunately, we no longer lack explanations for these events. We know fossil fuels and the destruction of nature by humans are the primary reasons for the alarming acceleration in global warming. Rajan Mehta's book, Backstage Climate, is an attempt to make us aware of global warming and climate change in a simple and interesting manner. It demystifies this grim reality, the science, the politics, and the economics behind climate change. In this episode, Rajan Mehta, together with Prem Panikar, give us a glimpse of the policies, technology, and solutions that can help save the planet and ensure our survival. This episode is adapted from an event that took place in the Bangalore International Centre in September of 2024.
Normally we start with the theme of the book, but you're a tech entrepreneur with quite a few years in that field, and you decide to take a sabbatical and do a 1-year deep dive into climate change in Harvard. Firstly, that's unusual. Secondly, I was wondering, what was that epiphany? Was there a trigger? Was there a moment in time when you thought you needed to go deeper into this?
The trigger actually happened probably around 15 years back or even more. We were having a social gathering at home with friends and family from different parts of the country and some from overseas also. And while we grown-ups were having a good time, the children were creating a ruckus around. And we wanted to get rid of them at that moment and leave us grown-ups alone. So somebody came with an idea that, give them some sheets of paper and some colors and let them go and draw outside. And we put a prize to it that, okay, come back, the best will get a prize from us. And half an hour later, they're all in a line and came back. And what really hit me was that most of the children who were from outside of Delhi drew the sky as blue, nice blue. And my kids who had lived in Delhi most of their life drew it as gray. And that was an awakening because in Delhi you don't see blue skies. But it hit me and I started reading about it. I got concerned about the pollution in Delhi. But honestly, that's where it stayed. And then COVID came. That gave a pause to all of us, right? And fortunately, the company that I had founded was in a cruise mode at that time, so I could afford to think differently. And I decided to take this sabbatical and pursue my interest. By that stage, because COVID gave time to all of us to read and do what we wanted, but I also felt it as a compulsion to go and do something about this very vital issue, which the world didn't seem to be paying too much attention to. At least the people that I was kind of hobnobbing with didn't seem to. So that's really what took me to Harvard, and I kind of decided to commit my time to climate change.
You talked about that moment when, because of the drawings that your kids did, you suddenly woke up to this whole thing of what is happening to our climate in general. What strikes me is, again, it's one of the tidbits that I picked up from your book. I wasn't aware of it before. There was a Swedish scientist who had predicted global warming 1896. And then there was, from about the 1950s, we've been tracking carbon emissions. In the 2000s, you've had Al Gore bringing it to the global platform with his talks, with the documentary An Inconvenient Truth. It strikes me centuries, or if you want to skip Keeling and the Swedish scientist whose name I forget at this point, even after Al Gore, it's 2 decades. And we still seem to be confused about what climate change is. We see Joshimat sinking, we say that's climate change, when it's actually building the wrong thing in the wrong place. So there is a knee-jerk use of climate change, and what that tells me is that people still haven't wrapped their heads around the core concept. Why is it so difficult to understand?
Climate is a complex issue. It's complex, and it's, in a traditional sense speaking, it's slow. The change is slow, but it doesn't remain slow forever. It accelerates at a point in time. And there are political issues around it, there are scientific issues, there are economic issues. It's not been brought to the center stages, wasn't brought for a very long time. Just to go on the time, this thing that you were mentioning, it was first spoken about in 1896. It was in 1988 that the IPCC was formed to investigate what this whole thing is all about. In 1992, then, the UN treaty, UNFCCC, was created. And it's now 32 years, and we still haven't done anything, right? One of the issues that I feel which has been impeding it, other than the fact that, like we were talking a little while back, it's death by 1,000 cuts. There are too many issues which are causing climate change. We'll come to that later. But climate faces 2 inherent issues or problems. One is it's a collective action issue, or the tragedy of commons, right? If I'm emitting carbon dioxide here, I'm not necessarily facing the consequences of it. It could be anybody in Timbuktu, or it gets averaged, and everyone may face similar consequences. So the perpetrator and the sufferer are not the same. Therefore, everybody becomes a perpetrator because we think it's somebody else's issue, right? Everyone's problem is no one's problem. And that's how countries have been pointing fingers at each other. Companies have been ignoring it. And we individuals also, you can see that thing in traffic here in Bangalore. You can see it in Delhi for pollution. We think our changing will not have any consequence. Let others do that. So I think that's one of the dampening factors. The other one is there is a time lag between the action you take for climate and the results you see. And it could be pretty long. Like India has committed to creating a carbon sink or planting, I think, 2 billion trees or something. But imagine, by the time the country thinks about it, they plan, they actually put money behind it, they acquired land, whatever else needs to be done, and then they plant trees. It'll be probably 30 years by the time those trees actually start giving you results, right? Whereas we are living in an age of instant gratification. We want things right now. And it's not only at the individual level, it's at the company's level, because most of the companies are now governed by the stock exchanges with quarterly results. Climate will need long-term investments, whereas they have to show results in every quarter. So the investments required for climate are not going into, the companies, whatever, they need to do. Also at the government level, we have elections every 4 or 5 years. Politicians come and go. But the moment they come, they're looking at the next election. And rightly so, that's their profession. And when they're there, they want to focus on development, on delivering growth, on showing people or giving people benefits which are today. So that's how, even in the political circles, you hear a lot of noise, but you don't see action. And that's one of the reasons why enough attention or money is not going into climate. So I would say these 2 factors could be the one.
Actually, 2-3 of the points that you made, one is about the instant gratification bit, one is about the time lag. These are things that I want to get into in greater detail. But honestly, to set it up, You did make the point that climate change is complex. You made the point that climate change has many touch points. It's not a single. It's not like, say, for instance, you have COVID. You trace it to a particular virus. You trace the virus to a point of origin. You cordon off things. You get, let's say, an antidote for the virus or a vaccine that protects you from the consequences of infection. There is no one touch point for climate change. So again, you don't find a silver bullet. There is no single path to a solution. But before we get into that kind of detail, Rajan, what I was wondering was, for all of us, could you give us a crash course in climate change? How does that happen? What are the touch points? How do the things interlink? Let's call it a dummy's guide to climate change.
Sure. Let me do two things. I'll try and paint a picture of what climate change could do to us, and then maybe explain the science behind it. So I'm sure all of you are aware about climate change because nature has been ringing its alarm bells every so often with heat waves, with floods, with sea level rise, with droughts. All these are being caused because of global warming, which means that the temperature, average temperature of the globe or the earth is going up. And this extra energy, so to say, is causing havoc. Just to give you an example, because of this global warming or rise in temperature, we are seeing glaciers are melting. There will be a day, if we continue the way we are, the temperature is rising, the glaciers will melt. If only the Antarctica and Greenland melt, the sea level will rise by around 200 feet. Now imagine most of our population is along the shores. Most of our cities, I'm talking globally, are around the shores. What happens to that population? And it's not only at the seashores. On the other hand, because of the temperature rise, we are getting arid lands. Places are becoming uninhabitable. They're turning into deserts, which means that the habitable land is shrinking. So as a result of that, migrations will happen. And we know whenever migrations happen, if you look back in history, wars follow. That's one consequence of climate change. And it's not only the humans who will migrate, the animals will also migrate, natural instinct. And what happens when the two come closer together, the proximity increases? There's a class of diseases called zoonotic diseases, which transfer from animals to human beings. The incidence of those will increase. There are certain animals called as reservoir hosts, which have pathogens which haven't yet crossed over to the human beings. COVID is one of the examples of that, could be. Now imagine the proximity between those animals and humans increasing. So the incidence of disease will definitely increase. The incidence of disease will also increase because climate change is not only bringing in heat, it's also bringing in humidity. And heat and humidity are a deadly combination for vectors. Mosquitoes, leeches will all increase. And with that, a whole host of diseases. Mental stress will increase, and so would accidents. The other fallout of climate change would be on the food systems. Not only the arable land is reducing, but food will get destroyed or crops will get destroyed because of heat, because of floods, and there'll be new pathogens which will destroy. So the human race is under challenge. We all need to be aware of that. Now, having said that, just to talk a little bit about the science behind climate change, if you really see, there's nothing new about climate change. Ever since the universe was created or our planet was created, the planet has been going through these cycles. It goes from a state where it's extremely warm to a state where it's extremely cold, from a state where it's all ice to a state where there's no ice. And these changes are governed by two phenomena. One is called the orbital cycle, and the other one is called the carbon cycle. The orbital cycle is based on the revolution of the Earth around the sun and also its own rotation. And there are three levers. The first one is called the Earth's eccentricity. The trajectory that the Earth follows around the sun changes from being a perfect circle to being an ellipse. And this happens every 100,000 years. What it does is it determines the amount of sunlight or sun's energy being received by different parts of the earth at different points in time. The second lever is the earth's tilt or the axis. As you know, the earth's axis is tilted and it varies from 22.1 degrees centigrade to 24.6. Again, what it does is it determines the amount of sun's energy reaching the North Pole. And North Pole plays a tremendous role in climate because most of the landmass is in the north. When the tilt is the least, the summers are short in the North Pole. And what happens as a combination of these two levers is, imagine if the Earth is at its farthest end from the sun and the axis is tilted to the minimum, the summers are really short and not very warm. So whatever ice or snow falls during the winter time does not melt fully during summers. So over years and decades and centuries, the ice starts building up and takes us into an ice age. The reverse is also true. When the Earth is at the closest and the tilted is at the other end, summers are long and hot. And over centuries, then it brings us back into a state where we are off the ice age. I hope that gives you an idea about the orbital cycle. Then there is the carbon cycle. Now, the amount of carbon in the Earth system is fixed, but it keeps moving between the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere, and the hydrosphere. For example, the flora and fauna that we see die, and when they die, decomposition happens, and some of the carbon gets into the ground, the rest of it gets into the atmosphere. This atmospheric carbon, some of it gets absorbed by the oceans, some of it gets washed down by rain, turns into carbonic acid, interacts with the rocks, mineralizes them, and makes carbonates which go into the ground. And so the carbon which gets into the ground through the flora and fauna over millions of years gets converted into fossil fuels. Similar phenomenon happens in the oceans. The marine life there, as it dies, sinks, that carbon goes in and we get fossil fuels. And fossil fuels from the ground get released to volcanoes and other leaks, right? So that keeps changing. Now, at a point in time when the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the least, it's the coldest. As carbon dioxide concentration starts building up, it starts getting warmer. When it's at its peak, it's really warm, and then it starts reversing back. Now, imagine a permutation combination where Earth is at its farthest end, the summers are short, and the carbon dioxide is at its minimum. It really pushes us into the ice age. And the reverse is also true. This is how the natural cycles happen. Now, the question I'm sure you would also ask me, Prem, is that if it's natural, if climatic cycles are natural, then why are we worried? Why are we talking or sitting here, worried? The issue is this time it's different. It's different because the change is on steroids. What we humans are doing is pulling out a lot of fossil fuels and by other means, putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what we are doing is putting additional greenhouse gases, like just to define greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitric oxide, and some other trace gases. These are all called greenhouse gases. We are really putting them at double speed or multiple speed into the atmosphere. And what they're going and doing is forming a blanket around the Earth. Just as in our normal life, in winters, we take a blanket. And what a blanket does for us is it doesn't bring extra heat from outside. It ensures that the body heat does not escape and keeps us warm. So in that form, this blanket of greenhouse gases is doing a similar job. It's keeping us warm. And honestly speaking, in some form, it's very beneficial because if there were no greenhouse gases, the average temperature of the Earth would be minus 18 degrees centigrade. Unlivable. It's because of greenhouse gases that we enjoy a comfortable 15 degrees. But the challenge is this blanket is getting thicker and warming at a very rapid pace and making us uncomfortable. And how this is happening is the Earth gets most of its energy from the sun. And we get this energy in the form of light energy or sunlight. And let's say there are 100 units of energy we are getting. 30 units of that energy actually gets reflected back into space. And that happens by way of a simple phenomenon that white surfaces reflect light away. So all the glaciers, all the clouds, and all the sand, white sand that you see, helps us in reflecting the light away. And it's only 70% that hits us. Imagine if 100% of sun's energy was hitting us, the world would be a much warmer place. Again, unlivable. Now, this 70% units of energy, which is coming to the earth, actually helps run the mankind. We do our day's work, everything from there. And in the night, like every object has to maintain its energy balance. So earth also maintains its energy balance. So in the night, whatever additional energy is there is radiated back by the earth. And it's radiated back as infrared rays or as thermal energy. So remember, when we received energy, it was light energy, but when we are radiating back, it's thermal energy. Now, these infrared rays, as they are escaping the earth, gases like oxygen and nitrogen, which form the maximum portion of the atmosphere, allow these to escape the earth transparently. But the greenhouse gases start blocking these infrared rays. And they do that because of their atomic structure. The electrons around these gases, their wavelength starts matching with the wavelength of the infrared rays. Just like in school physics, our teachers always told us that when there is a column of military or army guys walking over a bridge, marching over a bridge, they're always asked to break their step, because otherwise their steps start resonating with the frequency of the bridge and the bridge could collapse. And there have been real life cases like that. So kind of similar phenomenon is happening. Because the wavelength of the infrared rays and the electrons is matching, these get excited, take in the heat, and the temperature rises. And this heat is not radiated out, it's reflected back. And that's how this blanket that I spoke about is getting warmer and raising the temperature. This extra energy that is coming in is what is causing havoc and climate change.
Broadly speaking, summing up what you said, there are natural reasons why this happens. One of it is the movement of the earth, both around its own axis and also in relation to the sun. Also, the whole thing of the greenhouse gas cover and how that affects. And that's a beautiful analogy, by the way, that of a blanket which traps your own heat. Problem is, if you have two blankets on top of you, you have problems. Yeah. But what occurs to me is a point that you made early on in this dissertation, where you said that we are ramping up, or you used the words on steroids. Now, almost the entire mass of humankind falls into three broad categories. There is the agriculturist, there is the pastoralist, and there is the industrialist. And industry being used in a broad sort of sense for all kinds of manufacturing activity. It strikes me that a lot of the issues with excess carbon dioxide in the thing come from these three factors combined. So are we at that point saying that, look, what is happening is inevitable? We talk about the fact that if the temperature of the earth increases by 1.5 degrees Celsius more, which is expected to do sometime in the next 10 years, you've got your permafrost melting, you've got the polar ice cap melting, you've got the sea level rising to unimaginable levels, which basically means it wipes out pretty much all the coastlines. It wipes out the Polynesian islands. In fact, Kiribati, I think, is already...
That's right,
yeah. People are migrating out, and Rajan did make the point about environmental migration. This is not a prognosis. It's something that's actually happening right now. So you have all of that. And are we then saying that what we are facing is inevitable? If you're saying that a large contribution is from activities that we can't do without agriculture. We certainly can't do without the pastoralist. And we certainly can't do without, let's say, using a broad term, industry or development or whatever you want to call it. So are we on an inevitable death cycle?
If we do nothing and take life as usual and go on, I think we are on an inevitable, we are doomed. But I think human ingenuity will ensure we don't go that way. There have been many incidences earlier also where it almost seemed that the world is going to come to an end. But I think the alarm bells that rang made our scientists, our engineers, our entrepreneurs, and every one of us kind of take it as a challenge and address that, and we solve those problems. And I'm sure this time also we will do that, because you touched on the three categories and spoke about the inevitable. There is a lot happening to kind of control this crisis as well. And I think it's our job to talk about it as well and to work towards that if we were to really save our planet. And you kind of summed it up very well. See, it's important to understand the sources of the problem because only then you can find the solutions. The problem really is the greenhouse gases from whatever source they come. And therefore, we need to kind of control greenhouse gases if we want a solution. There are three main sources of greenhouse gases. The first and foremost is fossil fuels, which contributes approximately 70% of the greenhouse gases. The second is industry, which contributes another 20% or so. And the third is agriculture and land use, which contributes another 10%. Let's take a deeper look at how they are contributing and what changes are being brought in. If you look at fossil fuels, the majority of their use is in electricity generation. 70% of the electricity we use worldwide comes from fossil fuels. 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide is being spewed by these power plants every year into the atmosphere. Now, if you say that tomorrow, to save the planet, let's put all the lights off, the electricity, that ain't going to happen. We won't let it happen. So the world has started working on it. That's how you see the transition to renewable energy, to solar power, to wind power, and many other forms of electricity are being looked at. There are challenges in it because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So the supply and demand are not matching. Therefore, you need to come up with storage solutions. There is work being done on that. Slow, but at least it's started. However, I want to add here that even if we kind of shift to renewables like solar and wind, I don't think the climate problem is going to be solved so easily because where is the land for that? And these kind of new technologies are bringing their own set of problems with them because the waste that's going to be generated is going to be difficult to handle and creates its own carbon footprint. Nuclear is also waiting there. It was source of power we were using. Unfortunately, after the Fukushima thing, it's gone into a winter. But I must add here that there are some people who silently but surely have been working on nuclear. Bill Gates is one of them. He's been funding a lot of nuclear research. And there are technologies now which at least are said to have made it safer and cheaper, which were the two issues. I won't go into the details here, but I do want to mention this, that so far we were using nuclear fission as the base for nuclear power. And that had the problems because it would get into a chain reaction. While that's being worked upon, there's a new kid on the block, nuclear fusion, which is how the sun produces its energy. That's through nuclear fusion. So what they're trying to do is replicate the same here. And in nuclear fission, you would break the atom and that would release energy. In nuclear fission, you bring two atoms together and they release energy. The world's been working on that for a long time. And it was only 2 years back at the Livermore Berkeley Institute, they did a positive test, which means that the amount of energy that was released by bringing two atoms together was actually more than the energy that was used to fuse them together. So that's a very positive development. And I think considering the way our energy needs are increasing, because our lifestyles are becoming so comfortable, AI uses huge amount of energy. Many other technologies use huge amount of energy. So to cater to all that, you need an endless, bottomless source of energy. And probably nuclear fusion could be one of them. And there is work happening on that. The other major contributor in the fossil fuels for the greenhouse gases is transportation, cars, ships, planes. And you would have heard about the transition that's happening there with EVs coming in to replace the commercial and passenger ground vehicles. They're talking about green hydrogen for ships and sustainable fuel for aviation. So early stages, but I think the journey has started. And all of us need to participate in these programs. You know, next time we think about a car, think EV first. It would certainly help. The second category is industry. And just to give you an idea, Cement alone contributes around 6% carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Steel, another 5 to 6%. Now, industry gives out or emits greenhouse gases in two ways. One is by the energy it uses, the electricity it uses, or the fossil fuels it uses just for heating, because the reactions need heat. Huge amount of emissions are there. The other important and really high volume issue is also the chemical reactions that happen. For example, for cement, you have to convert limestone to lime, and you do it by heating limestone. And as you heat limestone, carbon dioxide gets emitted. Today, the world is emitting approximately 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide from cement alone every year. Now, work has started on that. First thing, if the energy we are able to shift to renewables, then that gets taken care of. For the chemical reactions, they're working on electrochemistry and bringing in green hydrogen to see that the transition happens smoothly. But it won't happen until we as consumers demand green cement and green steel. Industry starts producing it, and the policy framework encourages use and production of that. So all three need to fall in line for the change really to happen. All of us tend to think that something as natural as agriculture and land, how could that be a culprit in this whole thing? The world was earlier forested. There was natural growth, flora and fauna everywhere. And it acted as a natural carbon sink because of photosynthesis. It would, during the day, breathe in carbon dioxide and give out oxygen, help keeping things in balance. And then come agriculture, we had to clear the forests, right? And we did that by two ways, either by burning them or by cutting them. Either way, carbon dioxide got emitted, right, and added to the atmosphere and started kind of creating warming there. The second thing we do in agriculture is we till the land. And each time we till the land stores a lot of air and carbon dioxide that gets out and gets into the atmosphere. Also, the fertilizer that we put in has a lot of nitrogen. And when we till, that nitrogen comes out again, reacts with oxygen, gets converted into nitric oxide and up. And nitric oxide is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And then when we are growing crops, for rice, for example, we flood the fields. The moment we flood the fields, the microbes, there are certain microbes underneath, they undergo anaerobic fermentation and release methane. Methane is around 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. All this is adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and thickening that blanket that we spoke about. Even after the crops are harvested, worldwide, 30% of the food is wasted, right from the time it's harvested to transportation to retail and finally on our dining table. And wasted food means it gets decomposed, and decomposition means greenhouse gases are going up in the atmosphere. So this is how agriculture contributes. The big guys, however, are the livestock. And the world today has approximately 2 billion cattle or livestock spread all over. Majority of them, or a lot of them in India. And India is doubly kind of impacted because they live much longer here. Now what happens is, unlike we human beings, livestock has multiple stomachs. And in the first two stomachs, they are first two, depending upon what category we are talking about, they undergo anaerobic fermentation to break down the complex sugars that they take into simpler sugars. And this fermentation again gives out methane. And that's how you see them belching with that foam, and a lot of methane is given out. And that kind of is really spoiling or adding to the greenhouse gases. I also want to touch another point that, if I was to add 1 kg of weight, and let's say I have to have 10 kgs of food for that, for a similar addition of 1 kg weight for a cattle, they need to consume 8 times the food, that is 80 kgs of food. And where is this food coming from? It's not all through grazing. It's being grown. The forests are being cleared for that. 17% of Amazon has been cleared in the last 25 years just for cattle feed. And imagine the destruction it's doing. Again, the livestock also adds methane because of their manure. As it decomposes, methane is added. What are we doing about it? World over, as prosperity rises, more and more people are kind of jumping onto the getting their proteins from animal sources. So we need to control that. Some movements must have started for vegetarian food, but the industry is also working towards plant-based meat, right? There have been commercial launches, some successes, some failures, but I think the amount of work that is going on is one day we will crack it. Same way, there's probiotic feed, just like we take curds and we take Yakult to help our digestive system. There are probiotic foods being developed for the cattle to reduce their methane emissions. So good work happening, very slow right now. It needs money. It needs our embracing of these solutions to make a change. So these are the three categories, from where the greenhouse gases are coming, and some work that is happening, just to give you an idea.
One way of explaining the interconnectedness of things in the world is that old saying about a butterfly that flaps its wings in the Amazon and starts a storm somewhere off the Indian coast. Today it is a cow passing wind in India, causing typhoons over there. But you touched on the three major, let's say, axes of carbon emission. I still wanted to stay with the interconnectedness and to a point that you have raised in your book, which is a lot of activities that we don't immediately, and all of this is to drive home the point that when we think climate change, we seem to bucket it into a few things. Now we started bucketing it into carbon dioxide is being released there for climate change. Take it a step further. For instance, how does the war in Ukraine or the war between Israel, it's not a war, but the genocide in Gaza, how does that impact climate change? And the reason I ask you that is because you made the point about if we want to solve a problem, we've got to understand the problem. And one way of understanding that problem is looking at world events in our own backyard or halfway around the world and connecting it up or seeing if there are connections, right?
Just to give you an idea, military operations contribute around 5.5% of global greenhouse gases. And that's not just war, it's the exercises or the preparation for war that is responsible for it. The fire and fury that you see during the war is responsible for it. And most importantly, the rebuild that is required after the war is responsible for it. So all these activities do emit carbon dioxide. I just want to re-emphasize this point that there are only two things that cause or that are within our control to some extent to help avoid this crisis. One is, they say the ends justify the means. So the end is greenhouse gases. As long as we can control greenhouse gases, we'll be fine. Or control means, I'm wrong in saying we'll be fine because there's too much of it already in the atmosphere. We need to even reduce what is there in the atmosphere. The second thing is if we can increase the albedo effect. Albedo effect is what I spoke about earlier, that white surfaces reflect light away. If the white surfaces can be increased, then more of the light energy will get reflected back, and therefore we will absorb less energy and there'll be less global warming. These are the only two things I think within our means that we can do. To come back to your question of war, I spoke about it a little bit in our book. I don't want to rant about it here, but I just will touch upon it very briefly. Any kind of war will always contribute greenhouse gases because of the three things. You will prepare for it, you will indulge in it, and then you will rebuild. All these activities will entail greenhouse gases. So the issue is to avoid war. Now, how do you do that? In a family, when two siblings fight, the elders step in and they would take a decision, punish one of them, and it gets resolved. Similarly, in a nation, we have a judiciary or a judicial system. You go to a court with a dispute, they will put some fine on you, they will give a judgment, and as law-abiding citizens, you honor that, and the dispute gets resolved. Even in the international arena, there are these bodies. There's the World Trade Organization for trade disputes, there's the International Sea something for ocean, maritime, this thing. We also have the trinity of the UN system, the Secretary General as the voice of reason, the International Court of Justice as the adjudicator, and then the Security Council as the big daddy to impose and make sure that the decision is kind of followed. But somehow it's not working. The UN system doesn't seem to be working, right? So we need to see either how we strengthen that or come up with an alternate body which is free of fear and favor. And that body also needs to be given some tools. So one of the tools that I've written about briefly in the book as well is, should there be a tax on war? Because if you really see, nature was created equal for everyone. So nobody has the right to spoil nature that can adversely affect anybody else, your neighbors, your other country, whatever. So the proposal was that anybody getting into a war, you tax them. And you can tax them in different ways. You either tax people producing armaments, you tax the countries buying them, or you tax people getting into a war. And this pool of money goes into a fund which helps mitigate the greenhouse gases, use this money for transitioning to renewable energy or clean sources of energy, use this fund for adaptation, because a lot of people are suffering because of climate change. So whatever means you would like to use it for.
Sometime back, we talked about identifying a problem. COVID, okay, it's a virus. As looking through, and I have been following COP and the various other climate conferences, it reminds me of one of these old Sergio Leone westerns where at the end, everybody's got a pistol pointed at everybody else, all standing in a circle with a gun to sting. So when you ask who's responsible for this, somebody says it is the UK because of the Industrial Revolution. Somebody says it's the US post-World War II, when it embarked on that massive regeneration process. You make the point that if you look at it through the lens of who is currently producing the most amount of greenhouse gases, the finger points at China and India. If you're looking at who is per GDP, who is most responsible, the finger points somewhere else. If you look at per capita, then the finger points to a fourth party. Now, it strikes me that either we have to say that we are collectively responsible without parsing it and saying who was responsible at which particular point in time, or we can just do this little dance for the rest. The reason why I wanted to ask you about that is because we are stuck in this who is responsible, and therefore the money is not getting to the table because everybody's saying, why am I paying for it? UK says Industrial Revolution happened like decades ago. What have I got to do with this? Why am I putting money on the table? So how do we stop this Mulberry Bush dance and get down to brass tacks?
I think that's a very good question, very pertinent, Prem. I'll link it to what I said earlier. It's 32 years since the UNFCCC or the treaty was signed, and we haven't been able to solve the issue. 32 years is a long period otherwise. And the sole reason for that is what you just pointed out. We are not able to fix the responsibility. It's a complex issue.
Let me pause you there. At this point in time, when you're facing a collective disaster, do we even need to spend time fixing the responsibility?
Sure. I think the Paris Agreement has solved that to some extent. And let me explain how. Because, and I'll give you a little bit of a historical perspective, that initially, and rightly so, everybody came to this conclusion that the developed world has caused this problem. Therefore, they are responsible and they should pay for it. And the Kyoto Protocol was signed, but it was a dead horse. It never really delivered anything. The world soon realized that nothing is happening and junked it. And that's how they started working on the Paris Agreement. The whole idea of Paris Agreement was this collective thing, that this is a global issue and it's a stock and flow problem. The climate change is being caused by whatever greenhouse gases are there, and it's getting aggravated by the additional greenhouse gases that we are adding. So very deftly, the negotiators or the creators of the Paris Agreement came up with a term or a clause called common but differentiated responsibilities. The basic premise of that was that whoever has caused the problem, we understand, but we have a common goal now. We need to save this planet. So therefore, all of us need to march in the same direction. And it said, we also understand that not everyone has the same capability or resources to contribute equally towards that goal. Therefore, they said to the nations that were participating, and almost all nations participated, that you voluntarily tell us what can you contribute. This is our goal. We don't want to exceed this limit of emissions. So please tell us. And this was called the nationally determined contribution. So all the nations, the well-meaning ones and the not so well-meaning ones, went back to their drawing boards and started working out what they could contribute. And then came back and during the COPs started kind of committing that. So to some extent, they're all kind of at least agreed to march in the same direction. Mm-hmm. The challenge is that being voluntary, it has no legal binding, right? So a lot of people call the Paris Agreement as weak-kneed, and it is weak-kneed.
And right? It's also not just unenforceable, but also unmonitorable, right? To an extent.
It is unmonitorable, you're right to some extent, but it's left to countries' own discretion, honesty, judgment to come up with what they are doing and how much have they saved. And every 5 years, they do a stock take. But something good has happened and should always happen is the civil society needs to step up. And to some extent, they are. There are a few foundations worldwide which have now started tracking the commitments that countries are making. And you can go through their website and see, and they're ruthless. So I think that needs to happen. Plus, the responsibility lies with all of us. If our country has gone and committed at the COP, and then they're not doing it, then we need to hold their feet to fire and, make it an election issue, make it a voting issue, whatever, or raise our voices, because otherwise we will be the sufferers. So I think that part is happening. There is still a lot of greenwashing. People are still kind of pointing fingers. And there is this dichotomy you see between the developed and the developing world. Still, there is some justice to it. We all know problem was created by the developed world, and we are the kind of sufferers. It's a double whammy for the developing world. And I'll explain why. If you look at any country's, developing country's budget, India included, some portion of the government's revenue comes from fossil fuels. And a reasonable portion of it, in case of India, it's 18% of revenue, comes by way of customs duty that the government charges on import of oil, comes by way of local taxes on coal and other fossil fuels. It comes by way of royalties that the government gets from these fossil fuel companies, the cess and other things.
Yeah, Indian Railways is already in trouble, and
yeah, absolutely.
A large part of its revenue comes from transporting
absolutely.
Coal.
Now, if the government was to give up fossil fuels, 18% of the revenue just evaporates. And in a country or in a world, I'll take the example of India, where only 1% of our GDP goes into health. I'm not sure about the figures, correct me if I'm wrong, and 2.6% into education. If 18% of our revenue goes, these will further suffer our investments in the sectors where we need growth. So it's a difficult decision for the governments to take. And it's not only that. On the other hand, we are supposed to now transition our infrastructure to clean infrastructure, which means a lot of investments. So on one hand, developing countries are losing revenue. On the other hand, they have to invest, but they don't have the money. So where does this money come from? That's how we are kind of knocking and telling the developed world, if you want change, please put in the money, because we will suffer, but you will also suffer.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.